The finality of the act was in the closing of the door. It made a solid, oiled sound, the sound of wealth and final decisions. Elias Thorne did not slam it, he simply closed it, shutting Alara out of the life she had known. He stood on the porch of the mercantile, a man made of straight lines and dark wool, and pressed two things into her palm. One was a stack of coins, so few they barely made a weight. The other was a folded deed, the paper dry and brittle. "This is your inheritance, Alara," he said, his voice loud enough for the men lingering on the boardwalk to hear. He was her brother-in-law, the husband of her late sister, and now the sole executor of her father's modest estate. "The old Thorn Quarry. Your father always held on to it. It is yours now, free and clear, a piece of land to call your own." A murmur went through the small crowd. They knew the place. A played-out limestone pit 2 days' walk north of Promise Creek, a scar on the land that had produced nothing of value for 20 years. It was a place for rattlesnakes and summer heat, a hole in the ground. It was an insult, gift wrapped in legal paper. Mr. Gable, the town's assayer, coughed into his hand to hide a smirk. Alara looked from the deed to Elias's face, a mask of performative generosity. He had sold the house, the tools, the wagon. This quarry, legally hers through her father's stubborn sentiment, was the one thing he could not liquidate. So he gave it to her as a final public act of dismissal. He was washing his hands of his wife's penniless younger sister. She was 20. She had her father's worn coat, the clothes on her back, and the axe he had taught her to use, its hickory handle smooth with his labor. In her pocket, the coins Elias had given her amounted to $12. It was not enough for a stagecoach ticket to anywhere meaningful. It was just enough to starve slowly. "Go to the church," Mr. Gable advised, his voice thick with false pity. "They'll find a place for you. A woman alone has no business in the high country." Alara looked at their faces. She saw pity in some, contempt in others, but in all of them she saw the same certainty. She was finished. A piece of driftwood to be swept away by the current. Her gaze settled back on Elias. She nodded once, a short, sharp motion. She did not say thank you. The words would have choked her. She turned her back on the mercantile, on the men, on the town that had already buried her. She did not go to the church. She walked to the far end of town, to the blacksmith's forge. There she spent $3 of her $12 on a new shovel head and a heavy wedge. She spent $2 more on a large sack of salt, a box of matches, and a length of rope. The purchases were illogical. They were the tools of a settler, not a refugee. The blacksmith looked at her with confusion, but he took her money. With the axe over one shoulder and the new shovel head clanking against the wedge in her sack, she walked out of Promise Creek. She did not look back. She pointed her feet north, toward the worthless land that was now her only possession in the world. The cold autumn wind pressed at her back, a relentless hand, pushing her into the wilderness. The journey was a 2-day crucible. The land rose steadily, leaving the gentle valley behind for the sharp, stony bones of the high country. The trees grew thin and twisted, clinging to the rocky soil. The first night, she slept in the hollow of a great fallen pine, the axe beside her, every snap of a twig jerking her awake. The weight of her sack, filled with the salt and iron, dug into her shoulders, a constant reminder of the choice she had made. She was walking toward a grave, but she was doing it on her own terms. She ate sparingly, a handful of dried apples and a strip of jerky. The water from the streams was so cold it made her teeth ache. The silence was immense, broken only by the wind moving through the pines and the cry of a distant hawk. It was a lonely, punishing world, and she felt her own smallness within it. On the afternoon of the second day, she found it. She topped a rise and looked down into a wide, shallow bowl in the earth. The Thorn Quarry. It was worse than she had imagined. It was not a neat hole, but a sprawling, chaotic wound. A sheer cliff of pale, fractured limestone formed the back wall, 100 feet high and 3 times as wide. The quarry floor was a jumble of rubble, broken stones, and gravel sloping down from the rim. A few stubborn, skeletal bushes grew from the cracks, their leaves already withered. Alara slowly walked the rim, her heart sinking with every step. The town was right. Elias was right. This was nothing. It was a place of endings, a testament to failure. The wind, which had been at her back, now swirled inside the bowl, cold and unwelcoming. She slid down the gravel slope to the floor, her boots kicking up clouds of white dust. She stood in the center of the devastation and felt a wave of despair so profound it made her knees weak. The silence here was different. It was the dead silence of stone. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and stinging in the cold air. For a long moment she let the hopelessness wash over her. Then, as the sun began to dip toward the western peaks, she noticed something. The sheer rock face behind her was glowing. It had been soaking in the southern sun all day, and now it radiated a gentle, palpable warmth. She walked toward it and pressed her raw, cold palm against the stone. It felt like a living thing, holding the memory of the light. The air near the cliff was several degrees warmer than the air in the center of the quarry. There was no wind here, only a deep, profound stillness. Her eyes scanned the base of the wall. It was not a perfectly smooth line. In one section, a massive overhang created a natural rock shelter, 15 feet deep and 50 feet long. The ground beneath it was dry dust, protected from any rain, and there, near the back of the alcove, was a dark vertical fissure in the rock. From it, a single drop of water emerged, glistened for a moment, and fell with a faint patter onto a patch of damp stone below. Drip. Pause. Drip. She watched it for a full minute. It was slow, but it was constant. Clean water filtering through miles of limestone. She knelt and touched the damp patch. It was slick with a fine gray clay. She looked up at the overhang, then at the wall of sun-warmed stone, then back at the steady, life-giving drip. The despair did not vanish, but it was joined by something else, a grim, hard resolve. The town had given her a hole in the ground, but the hole had a secret. It had stone that held heat, a roof that nature had already built, and water. It was not a grave, it was a beginning. The first week was a blur of brutal labor. Her world shrank to the quarry, her body a machine fueled by dwindling provisions and sheer will. She started by clearing the space beneath the rock overhang. She used the new shovel to move tons of loose gravel and smaller rocks, creating a level floor. Her hands, soft from a life indoors, blistered on the first day. By the second, the blisters had broken, leaving raw, weeping skin. She tore strips from her spare chemise and wrapped them, the rough cloth a poor substitute for proper gloves. The pain was a constant, screaming fire, but she learned to work through it. Her muscles screamed in protest. Every morning she woke so stiff she could barely move, the cold of the pre-dawn air seeping into her bones. She would force herself up, eat a piece of dry bread, and pick up the shovel again. The pile of cleared rock grew into a long, low wall at the edge of the cleared space, a demarcation between the chaos of the quarry and the order she was imposing. Once the floor was level, she began the main structure. Her plan was simple, born of necessity. She would build a front wall connecting the two ends of the rock overhang, enclosing the space completely. The back and the roof were already there, a gift of the mountain itself. For the wall, she needed stone and timber. The stone was everywhere, but it was fractured and irregular. She spent days sorting through the rubble, selecting the flattest, most stable pieces she could lift. She hauled them one by one, her back and legs burning with the strain. Some were so heavy she could only roll them end over end, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She stacked them carefully, creating a foundation for her wall. For timber, she had to climb out of the quarry to the thin woods on the rim. Her father had taught her the art of the axe, the way to read a tree's lean, the precise angle of the notch. She chose dead, standing pines dry and seasoned. The sharp crack of her axe was the only sound for miles. Felling a tree was one thing, getting it down into the quarry was another. She would cut the trunks into 10-foot lengths, then laboriously roll and drag them to the rim, nudging them over the edge to crash onto the quarry floor below. The danger was immense. A slip, a misstep, and she would follow the log down. She used the timbers for the frame of her front wall, setting them upright and bracing them against her low rock foundation. For mortar, she turned to the seep. She dug out the clay deposit, mixing the slick gray mud with water and limestone dust. It was a crude, weak mortar, but it was enough to fill the gaps between the stones she painstakingly lifted into place between the timber uprights. It was slow, agonizing work. Each stone had to be fitted, turned, and settled into place. The wall rose an inch at a time. As she worked, she refined her other systems. She used her shovel to deepen the area around the water seep, creating a small pool. She spent 2 days lining it with the thickest clay, patting it smooth until it formed a watertight basin, a cistern that could hold 30 gallons of clear, cold water, constantly replenished. It was her most precious resource. The greatest challenge was the fireplace. She needed warmth, and she needed a way to cook. Building a freestanding chimney was beyond her skill. But the great limestone wall had another secret. High above the overhang, she had seen a deep, dark fissure running vertically up the cliff face. She prayed it connected to the space below. She chose a spot against the back wall, deep inside her new enclosure, and began constructing a massive hearth and firebox from the largest, flattest stones she could find. It took her 4 days of lifting and fitting. Finally, she laid a small, tentative fire inside. A plume of smoke rose, curled, and then miraculously was drawn upward. It vanished into a crack at the back of the firebox. Minutes later, standing outside, she saw a thin, gray wisp of smoke emerging from the fissure 100 feet above. A natural chimney. The relief was so great she sat down hard on the dusty floor and wept. The massive stone of the quarry wall behind the fireplace became the heart of her home. After the fire burned for a few hours, the rock itself began to warm. Long after the flames died to embers, the limestone radiated a steady, gentle heat into the enclosure. It was a thermal battery, a reservoir of warmth. She had not just built a shelter, she had built a system for surviving the cold. With the walls up and the fireplace drawing, she built a door from the leftover pine logs, splitting them into rough planks and lashing them together with her rope. It was heavy and crude, but it closed the final gap. She chinked the walls with a mixture of clay and dried moss, sealing every crack against the wind. The first night she spent inside the completed shelter was a revelation. Outside, the autumn wind howled across the quarry rim. Inside, there was only the soft crackle of the fire, the radiant warmth from the stone, and a profound, secure silence. Her food was nearly gone. Survival now depended on more than just shelter. She spent another week hauling things, but this time it was not stone. She climbed to the woods above the quarry, filled her empty provision sacks with the dark, rich soil she found under the pines, and carried it, load by agonizing load, down into the quarry. On the sun-drenched floor in front of her shelter, she built 3 long, low-walled garden beds from the remaining rubble. She filled them with the forest soil. It was a desperate, back-breaking act of faith. She knew she needed more. She needed a renewable source of food. With her last $6 clutched in her hand, she walked the 2 days back to Promise Creek. Her arrival caused a stir. She was thinner, her face weathered, her hands scarred and calloused. Her clothes were stained with dust and clay. She was a wild thing. She ignored the stares and whispers. She walked into Elias Thorne's mercantile. He was standing behind the counter, polishing the wood. He looked up, and his face registered a flicker of shock before settling back into a mask of condescension. Ilara," he said smoothly. "Come for charity at last? I told you the church would—" "I need 2 nanny goats, 3 laying hens, a sack of winter wheat seed, and a bag of potatoes for planting," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. She placed her money on the counter. Elias stared at the coins, then back at her. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. "Goats? In that rock pile? What will they eat, Stones?" The men loafing by the stove chuckled. The joke spread through the store. They started calling her Cave Girl and the Follies Queen. Ilara's gaze did not waver. "Is my money good here, Elias?" He shrugged, the smile never leaving his face. He took her money, all of it. He sold her the oldest goats and the scrawniest chickens he had. It was another insult, another way of telling her she was wasting her time. She accepted the animals without complaint. She bought a small amount of feed with the last of her change. Leading 2 stubborn goats on a rope and carrying 3 squawking chickens in a crate was harder than the walk out. It took her 3 days to get back. The townspeople watched her leave, shaking their heads. They saw a fool leading livestock to their doom. They did not see a woman building an ark. Back at the quarry, she built a small, lean-to pen for the animals against the side of her main shelter, using the last of her timber. It was cramped, but it was protected from the wind and shared some of the warmth that bled through the stone. The goats, contrary to Elias's prediction, found plenty to eat, nibbling on the tough bushes and weeds that grew in the crevices of the quarry. One evening, a week after her return, a new visitor appeared. A dog, skeletal and wary, with ribs showing through its matted coat, stood at the edge of the quarry floor watching her. It was a stray, driven from the town and surviving on its own. Ilara left out a bowl with a little goat's milk. The dog crept forward, lapped it up, and retreated. She did this every night. After a week the dog was sleeping by her door. She named him Shale, for the broken rock he had emerged from. He became her shadow, her guard, her only companion in the vast, silent world she inhabited. His warm presence at her feet during the long nights was a comfort beyond measure. The mockery from Promise Creek followed her, even in her isolation. The nickname she had earned, the Stone Woman, was carried by the few hunters who passed through the high country. One of them, a big, confident trapper named Brant, stopped at the rim of her quarry one afternoon in late November. He looked down at her small, ordered world, the stone shelter, the neat garden beds now covered with crude cold frames made of scavenged wood, and a few panes of glass she'd found, the goats picking their way across the rubble. And he laughed. "You're still here," he called down, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. "I admire the effort, girl. I truly do. But when the first big snow hits, that hole is going to be your tomb. You can't fight a winter in these mountains with mud and prayer." Ilara was banking the soil high against the walls of her garden beds. She did not look up. She did not acknowledge him. Her silence was more powerful than any argument. It infuriated him. "Don't say I didn't warn you," he shouted, and went on his way, carrying the story of the mad woman in the quarry back to town, another log on the fire of their collective certainty. Winter arrived not with a single storm, but as a slow, creeping siege. The days grew short, the light thin and gray. The wind developed a new, keener edge. For Ilara, life settled into a deep, quiet routine. Her world was the 100-yard span of the quarry floor. Each day began before dawn. She would rise in the dark, the air in the shelter cool but not frigid, the great stone wall still breathing the last of yesterday's fire. She would build the fire back up, the scent of pine smoke filling the enclosed space. While the fire grew, she would milk the 2 goats. Their warm milk frothing in the bucket was a daily miracle. She drank some and set the rest aside to make cheese. The chickens, huddled in their pen, would give her 1 or 2 precious eggs a day. After tending the animals, she would check her water. The cistern, fed by the constant seep, never froze. It was the lifeblood of her homestead. Then came the work of the day, chopping firewood from the logs she had stockpiled, reinforcing the chinking in her walls against the probing wind, checking the snares she had set for rabbits in the woods above. The garden was her proudest achievement. Under the glass-topped cold frames, protected from the wind and warmed by the heat-retaining stone floor, hardy greens and lettuces still grew. It felt impossible, seeing that vibrant green against the backdrop of the gray, frozen landscape. It was a secret between her and the quarry. In the long, dark afternoons, she worked inside. She ground the winter wheat into coarse flour using 2 flat stones. She mended her clothes, her fingers clumsy with a needle. She planned. She calculated her resources, the firewood, the feed for the animals, the sacks of potatoes and carrots she had harvested and stored in a deep cold pit she had dug in the corner of her shelter. She was utterly alone, but she was not idle. She was the sovereign of a kingdom of stone and warmth, its borders defined by her own labor. Shale was her silent court, his head always resting on her feet as she worked. Before the great blizzard, a smaller storm served as a test. A heavy wet snow fell for a day and a night, followed by a hard freeze. In the morning, a section of the quarry rim above her shelter, heavy with snow and loosened by the freeze-thaw cycle, gave way. A river of rock and ice cascaded down, striking the edge of her roof with the sound of a cannon shot. The timbers groaned but held. For 2 days, she and Shale were trapped inside by a wall of debris that blocked her door. She had to dig her way out with the shovel, her heart pounding with the knowledge of how close she had come to being buried alive. The incident taught her a vital lesson. The mountain was not her friend. It was a neutral, powerful force she had to respect and prepare for. She spent the next week building a low-angled diversion wall of heavy stones on the roof of her shelter, designed to deflect any future rockfalls. The town of Promise Creek met that first snow with confidence. They had their log homes, their stockpiles of wood, their community hall. They were prepared, as they always were. The story of Alara's near disaster, brought back by another hunter, only confirmed their judgment. She was living on borrowed time, a fool tempting fate. Then, in the 3rd week of December, the sky turned the color of lead. The wind dropped to an unnerving stillness. The air grew heavy, expectant. The old-timers in town felt it in their bones. This was not just another storm. This was something different. This was the blizzard of '83. It arrived not as flakes, but as a solid wall of white moving down from the peaks. The wind came with it, a low moan that rose to a piercing, relentless scream. It was a physical assault, a hammer of cold and ice against the world. Snow did not fall. It flew horizontally, driven by a wind that seemed intent on tearing every nail from every board. The world outside vanished. There was no sky, no ground, only a churning, blinding chaos. In Promise Creek, the first day was a struggle. By the second, it was a catastrophe. The snow was measured in feet, not inches. It piled on roofs with unimaginable weight. The first to go was the roof of the livery stable, collapsing with a great groan, killing half the horses inside. The wind found every crack in the town's log cabins, forcing icy dust through the walls. Families huddled around their fireplaces, feeding them constantly, but the cold was a living entity, seeping in, stealing the warmth. Firewood, stockpiled for a normal winter, was being consumed at a terrifying rate. Chimneys, battered by the wind and choked with snow, began to fail, filling homes with blinding, acrid smoke. Mr. Gable's house caught fire, and the town could do nothing but watch it burn, the flames a furious orange against the white maelstrom. The community's confidence shattered. They were isolated, freezing, and their conventional preparations were collapsing around them. In her quarry, Alara listened to the storm. The wind howled and shrieked across the rim high above, but down on her protected floor it was only a muffled roar. Her low, solid shelter, braced by the mountain itself, did not tremble. The tons of rock and earth above her were the perfect insulation. Inside, a quiet order prevailed. The fire in her massive stone hearth burned steady and hot. The great limestone wall behind it was a furnace of stored warmth, radiating a deep, penetrating heat that filled the entire space. Her small stockpile of wood was barely touched. The efficiency of her system was remarkable. The goats and chickens were calm in their adjoining pen, sheltered and warm. Her cistern was full of water. Her stores of food were secure. The green lettuce in her cold frames was untouched. She was not fighting the storm. She was living outside its reach. She sat by the fire, mending a harness for the goats, the rhythmic work a comfort against the fury of the world outside. Shale slept at her feet, twitching in his dreams, utterly untroubled. On the third day of the blizzard, the sound of the wind was joined by something else. A frantic, desperate banging on her crude wooden door. Shale erupted in a volley of deep-chested barks, the hair on his back rigid. Ilara froze, her heart leaping into her throat. No one should be out in this. No one could be. The banging came again, weaker this time, followed by a heavy slump against the wood. She grabbed a burning log from the fire for a torch, her axe in her other hand. Unbarring the heavy door, she pulled it inward. A figure, completely encased in snow and ice, fell into the room, collapsing onto the stone floor. It was Brant, the trapper. His face was a mask of frozen blood and ice, his lips blue. He was barely conscious. He had been a big man, full of swagger and certainty. Now he was a broken, frozen heap at her feet. For a single, cold moment, she remembered his words. "That hole is going to be your tomb." The memory was bitter. She looked at her dwindling firewood, her carefully rationed food. Helping him would come at a cost to her own survival. It was a choice. Let the man who mocked her face the consequences of his own arrogance, or honor the unwritten law of the wilderness. You help who you can. The choice was never really in doubt. She slammed the door against the storm, dragged Brant closer to the fire, and began the slow, painful work of saving his life. She cut away his frozen clothes, her hands recoiling from the icy shock of his skin. She wrapped him in the blankets from her own bed. She melted snow for warm water and forced broth made from salted rabbit between his chattering teeth. He had mocked her home, and now her home was the only thing keeping him from the grave. She worked through the night, her face grim, her actions efficient. She was not saving him because he deserved it. She was saving him because she could. Brant was the first. He woke the next morning, weak and delirious, his eyes wide with disbelief. He was in a warm, dry room that smelled of wood smoke and baking bread. He saw the goats, the chickens, the faint light coming through a small glass-covered window she had set in the wall. He stared at the massive stone wall, warm to the touch. He could not reconcile this place, this sanctuary, with the frozen pit he had mocked. "How?" he rasped, his throat raw. "The stone holds the heat," Ilara said simply, ladling more broth into a bowl. "The mountain blocks the wind." 2 days later, as the blizzard finally began to wane, another visitor arrived. This one was a young man, the clerk from Elias Thorne's mercantile, half dead on his feet. He had been sent out with 2 others to check on the outlying homesteads. He was the only one who had made it back, and only because he had seen the impossible. A thin, steady plume of smoke rising from the direction of the old Thorne quarry. He stumbled into Ilara's shelter, and his shock was even greater than Brant's. He saw not a hermit on the edge of death, but a survivor in her fortress. He saw the organized stores of food, the healthy animals, the cistern of clean water, the small patch of green growing under glass. It was a world in miniature, a self-contained system of life in the heart of a dead, frozen landscape. His mind, steeped in the town's narrative of the foolish girl in the cave, could not process what he was seeing. The warmth hit his face, and the sheer impossibility of it all made him weep. Ilara fed him, gave him a place to rest, and then sent him back with a sled she had built from scrap wood, loaded with firewood, and 2 sacks of potatoes. "Tell them to come here," she said. "Bring the children first." The clerk's return to Promise Creek was a bombshell. The town was in ruins. 2 families had been found frozen in their homes. Starvation was a day or 2 away for many. The community hall, their designated shelter, had a cracked main beam and was dangerously cold. When the clerk described what he had found in the quarry, they first thought he was mad, his mind broken by the cold. But he had brought proof: the firewood, the potatoes, the story of warmth and life. It was Elias Thorne who led the first party out. His pride was a small, cold thing now, buried under the weight of his responsibility for the town's survival. He and 3 other men trudged through the massive drifts, following the clerk's tracks. When they arrived at the quarry, they stopped at the rim and stared down. The place was transformed. The chaotic pit was now an ordered homestead. Smoke rose from the hidden chimney. A clear path was shoveled from the shelter door to the animal pen. Through the small window, they could see the flicker of a fire. It was a scene of impossible peace and security. They made their way down. Ilara met them at the door. She was not triumphant. She was not angry. Her face was calm, her eyes steady. She simply stood aside to let them in. The men stepped from a world of brutal, killing cold into a pocket of deep, radiant warmth. The shock of it silenced them. They stared at the sleeping form of Brant, the trapper, tucked into a corner. They saw the shelves of preserved food, the quiet animals, the sheer, unbelievable functionality of it all. Elias Thorne's gaze swept over the ingenious systems: the fireplace built into the thermal mass of the mountain, the protected water source, the enclosed gardens. He, a man of commerce and practicalities, understood instantly the genius of what she had done. She had not chosen a worthless piece of land. She had chosen the best piece of land. She had seen what no one else could see. He turned to face her, his face pale, his arrogance stripped away, leaving only a raw, painful humility. The other men looked down, ashamed. They remembered the jokes, the mockery, the derisive nicknames. "We were wrong," Elias said, his voice thick. "We called you a fool. My God, Ilara, we were the fools." He looked around the warm, life-filled space again. "We left you to die. You built an ark." Ilara's response was her greatest victory, and it was delivered with quiet grace. She did not say, "I told you so." She did not remind him of his cruelty. She simply gestured toward the pot simmering over the fire. "There is stew," she said. "The fire is warm. Go back and bring your families. Take what you need." In that moment, she was not the outcast. She was the leader. Her character, forged in solitude and labor, had proven stronger than their judgment, stronger even than the storm itself. In the days that followed, the Thorn Quarry became a refugee camp. Ilara's small shelter was the heart of the operation, the warm center from which the rescue of Promise Creek was staged. She organized the able-bodied men, sending them out with her sled to bring back the weakest families. Her home, built for 1, somehow made room for 20. The children slept closest to the great stone wall, wrapped in blankets, safe from the cold for the first time in a week. She shared everything she had. Her stores of potatoes and carrots, her smoked meat, her coarse flour, it all went into the communal pot. She showed them how her systems worked, explaining the simple, powerful logic of thermal mass and wind protection. The people who had pitied and mocked her now looked at her with a kind of reverence. They had built with wood, fighting the cold every winter. She had partnered with the stone, and the stone had kept her safe. When the storm finally broke and the sun returned, shining on a transformed white world, the community was forever changed. They returned to their battered town, not as they had left it, but as a people who had been humbled, saved by the very person they had cast out. The name Stone Woman was still used, but now it was spoken with awe. It was a title, not an insult. Elias Thorne was a diminished figure. He helped with the rebuilding, but his authority was gone, replaced by a quiet deference to his sister-in-law. He never again stood on the porch of his mercantile dispensing judgment. He had been shown the fragility of his own wisdom. The impact of Ilara's creation spread beyond the immediate aftermath. As Promise Creek rebuilt, they did so with new knowledge. Houses were built with stone foundations dug into hillsides. Fireplaces were constructed with massive stone backings. The lessons of the quarry, of working with the land, not just upon it, were woven into the fabric of the town's recovery. Travelers carried the story of the blizzard of '83 and the woman in the quarry to other settlements, and her legend grew. Her shelter was no longer Thorn's Folly. It became known throughout the territory as Ilara's Hold. Years passed. Ilara never left the quarry. She expanded her home, carving new rooms from the limestone, enlarging her gardens, building a proper barn for a growing herd of goats and a milk cow. People came to her not for rescue, but for advice. They came to trade for her winter vegetables, which grew in a large greenhouse she built against the sun-facing wall. They came to learn how to build what she had built. She taught them freely, sharing the wisdom she had earned with her own 2 hands. She never married, finding a deep and abiding peace in the life she had created with only the descendants of shale for constant company. One evening in late autumn, decades after she had first walked into that desolate pit, Ilara stood on the quarry rim. She was an old woman now, her back bent from a lifetime of labor, her hands permanently shaped by the stone and the axe. She looked down at the homestead below. It was a place of warmth and life, smoke curling from the chimney, lanterns glowing in the windows, the sound of animals settling in for the night rising on the crisp air. She had been sent to this place with nothing, expected to fail, to vanish. Instead, she had put down roots in the barest of rock and built a legacy. She had learned that the most worthless places can hold the greatest secrets, and that the strength of a person is measured not by what they are given, but by what they build when they have nothing. The wind blew cold and sharp with the promise of another winter, but it held no fear for her. She was the stone woman of the quarry, and she was home.